The sun was low over the wide prairie, spilling its light in long gold streaks across the open land. Dust rose from the cattle trail and drifted toward the weather-worn porch of a lonely ranch house. Out here, everything seemed slower, heavier, as if time itself had to work harder just to move forward. A man sat with his elbows on his knees, hat pulled low, staring at nothing in particular. His hands were calloused, the kind only years of hard labor could carve, and his boots carried the wear of endless miles across dry ground. Folks in town called him the old rancher, though truth be told, he wasn't as ancient as they made him sound. But the lines on his face and the silence in his eyes carried the weight of more than years. Inside the house, life felt smaller, quieter, yet not without its own currents. A young maid moved carefully from room to room, hands busy with simple work, though her eyes often flickered toward the windows as if searching for something beyond her chores. She wasn't bold, not the type to raise her voice or set her will against another. She carried herself in that shy, gentle way that made her seem half afraid of the world and half yearning to be seen within it. And though her steps were soft, the old rancher had noticed long ago how her presence filled the empty spaces in that house. The land around them didn't offer much company. Neighbors were far off and visits grew rare as the seasons wore on. The sound of cattle, the creak of windmill blades, and the rustle of dry weeds were often the only voices between sunrise and dusk. A man could get lost in such silence, and a woman too. That stillness could carry comfort or loneliness, depending on how it settled on the heart. The rancher had grown used to the silence. After years of losing more than he had gained, he had made peace with quiet company. Yet the maid, with her downcast eyes and nervous hands, stirred something unsettled in him. She moved like someone carrying a secret, though he told himself he had no right to wonder what it was. Still, the question hovered in the space between them. Whenever she lingered a little longer than necessary, or when her voice trembled while asking the simplest things, it was on an evening when the prairie air grew thick with the smell of coming rain that the moment slipped upon them. The maid stood near the doorway, wringing her hands on her apron, her cheeks flushed though the house was cool. The old rancher glanced her way, intending to ask if she needed something, but the words died on his tongue when he saw the look in her eyes. There was fear there, but also a desperate kind of courage, the kind that only shows itself when someone has nowhere left to run. Her voice broke the heavy silence, thin at first, as if she might change her mind halfway through. "I'll do anything a man wants," she whispered, though the words trembled with more plea than promise. Her face turned away almost as soon as they left her lips, ashamed of her own boldness. The rancher's hands froze on his knees. For a moment he did not even breathe. He had lived long enough to hear all manner of things spoken in saloons, along trails, or whispered by men who had drunk too much whiskey. But hearing it here, from the timid maid who had never dared raise her eyes too long, struck him still as stone. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, far but nearing. The smell of wet earth rose stronger through the open window. The rancher felt as though the storm had already broken inside the house. 1,000 thoughts pressed against him at once, none of them finding their way into words. He did not move, only stared at the floor as if it might give him an answer. The maid, heart pounding so hard she thought it might be heard aloud, gripped her apron tighter. She hadn't meant to speak it that way. The words had come out wrong, carrying more weight than her soul could bear. What she wanted, what she needed, was something she had no language for. But silence had trapped her for too long, and in breaking it, she had given voice to the only desperate shape her feelings could take. The rancher's breath came slow again, yet his hands still had not moved. She dared a glance toward him, searching his face, but found it locked in stillness. The lines there, carved deep by sun and sorrow, looked harsher than ever in the dim light. His eyes remained hidden under the brim of his hat, yet she felt them heavy upon her all the same. The moment stretched, cruel in its length. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling against loose boards, but the louder sound was the silence between the two souls in that house. The maid stood waiting, every second a battle between hope and regret. The old rancher sat frozen, caught between the echoes of his past and the pull of something unknown in his present. Somewhere, deep in the house, a door creaked on its hinges as the wind shifted. The maid flinched at the sound, and the rancher finally lifted his head. There. Eyes met at last, shy gaze against weathered stare, and the world seemed to shrink to just that single space between them. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The thunder cracked sharp, closer now, shaking the windows in their frames. The lamp flickered once before steadying, shadows jumping across the walls. And still, the rancher did not answer. His silence was heavier than any reply could have been. The maid stood rooted, not knowing whether to flee or to wait, torn between shame and the faintest glimmer of something she did not dare name. The prairie outside darkened as the first drops of rain struck the porch roof. The storm was upon them. Inside, the air was thick, charged with the same restless electricity. The old rancher shifted at last, as if waking from a long stillness, but the words he needed remained locked tight behind his lips. The maid's heart sank and lifted all at once, as though both hope and despair shared the same breath. And then, just as lightning split the horizon and the ranch house shook under the weight of the storm, the old rancher froze once more, caught in that fragile instant between decision and silence. While the maid's pleas still hung unanswered in the air, the rain came down hard against the ranch roof, each drop striking like a drumbeat in the silence between them. The old rancher stayed still, hands resting heavy on his knees, while the maid clutched at her apron as if it could anchor her trembling frame. Neither spoke. The storm outside filled the air with a roar, but inside, the quiet was louder still. The maid had never spoken so boldly in her life, and already the words weighed on her like chains. She could not take them back, could not pretend they had not fallen from her lips. And now, with the rancher frozen, her heart sank under the weight of not knowing what he would do. The rancher's eyes lifted at last, his weathered face pale under the lamplight. He did not speak. He could not. For years he had buried himself in work and land in silence. He had taught himself that nothing good could come of longing, that men like him had no business reaching for what they did not deserve. Yet here was this shy maid, this quiet shadow in his home, suddenly thrusting before him a plea that cut deeper than any wound he had carried. The storm rattled on, and the memory of another storm long ago crept into his mind. He remembered the night when lightning struck the barn, flames rising so fast he had thought the whole place would burn. He had run into the fire, coughing, choking, fighting to pull the horses free. That same feeling returned to him now, that helpless panic of being caught between saving something precious and being swallowed whole by the fire. Only this time, it was not the barn at stake. The maid felt his gaze, even through the silence. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of her own words. She had not meant to sound desperate, though desperation had indeed driven her to speak. All her life, she had been passed from one place to another, never belonging, always working in corners where no one truly saw her. The ranch had given her shelter, but it was still not hers, still not a place she could claim as her own. She feared that her worth would always be measured in chores and quiet obedience. And in that fear, she had spoken what she thought a man might want, even though the truth inside her was far more fragile. Her hands twisted the fabric of her apron until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to run, to disappear into the sound of the storm, but her feet would not move. She wanted to cry out that she hadn't meant it that way, that her heart was begging not for duty, but for belonging, for someone to see her as more than what she did. But her tongue was tied in knots, and the old rancher's silence was its own cage. The rancher leaned back slowly, his chair creaking under the shift. His hat slid back slightly, revealing eyes clouded with something unreadable. He looked at her not as a master to a servant, not as one with power over another, but as a man cornered by a truth he could not name. The thunder rolled again, and the shadows deepened in the room, stretching long across the walls. Outside, the cattle stirred in the storm. A low bellow echoed across the land, and the maid jumped at the sound. Her nerves were frayed to threads, each small noise pressing heavier against her. She wished she could vanish into the walls, wished she could undo the moment. Yet something inside her, something stronger than fear, still held her there in front of him. The rancher thought of the years gone by, of the promises he had once made to himself. He had sworn off dreams after too much loss, swore never to put hope in fragile things again. But as he looked at the maid standing before him, trembling yet unyielding, he felt the ground shift beneath those old vows. He did not trust himself to speak, for he knew words could not be unsaid. So he sat in silence, bound by a fear older than he cared to remember. The storm carried on deep into the night. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled across the prairie like a voice from another world. The maid slipped away at last, retreating to the small room she had claimed for herself at the far end of the house. She shut the door softly behind her and pressed her back against it, breathing hard. She did not know what would come of what. She had said only that she could no longer pretend she felt nothing. The old rancher remained where he was, staring into the flickering lamp until the wick burned low. His hands trembled when he finally reached for the lamp to snuff it out. He had faced storms, fire, and hunger without fear, yet tonight he felt undone by a few simple words spoken by a girl half afraid to raise her voice. Sleep did not come easy. He lay awake listening to the rain, thinking of her face when she spoke, the quiver in her voice, the strength hidden beneath her timidness. Morning came slow and gray, the prairie drenched in the storm's passing. The land smelled of fresh rain and wet earth, a reminder that storms always left something behind. The maid rose early, as she always did, and busied herself with chores, though her hands moved clumsily, her mind elsewhere. The rancher, too, moved through his work with a heaviness he could not shake. Days passed, and though neither spoke of that night, the air between them remained charged. The maid avoided his eyes more than before, yet she felt his gaze follow her when she turned away. The rancher kept his words locked tight, but his silence was no longer the calm kind. It was restless, uneasy, as though something unspoken walked between them with every step. One evening, after the chores were done, the rancher found himself standing near the barn, watching the horizon burn red with the setting sun. The maid came walking back from the chicken coop, her figure small against the wide sky. He thought of calling to her, thought of asking her what she had meant that night, but the words again refused him. Instead, he stood there, hat in hand, staring at the ground while the moments slipped away. The maid, too, carried her own burden. She thought often of leaving, of finding work elsewhere, far from the silence that had become unbearable. But she could not bring herself to go. Something bound her to that place, though she could not name it. Perhaps it was the rancher himself, his quiet strength, the sorrow in his eyes that mirrored her own. Or perhaps it was simply the hope that one day the silence between them would break. Nights grew colder as the season shifted. The prairie wind carried a sharp bite, and the days grew shorter. With each passing evening, the tension in the house deepened, as if both knew that something had to give. The maid prayed silently for courage, while the rancher fought with the ghosts of his past. One night, as the wind howled again through the empty fields, the rancher sat alone by the fire, lost in thought. The maid lingered near the doorway, her eyes catching the firelight. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, retreating a step. But the rancher lifted his head, his voice rough from disuse. "Why did you say it?" he asked. The maid froze, her breath caught. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She gripped the doorframe, unsure if she should answer or run. The weight of the question hung in the air, heavier than the storm that had passed nights ago. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. The rancher's eyes never left her, steady and searching. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath, and though her voice was soft, it carried the strength of a truth too long held inside. But before the words could fully leave her, the wind outside slammed a shutter hard against the wall, startling them both. The firelight flickered wildly, shadows stretching across the room. The maid stopped, caught between confession and silence, while the rancher's gaze held her steady. The unanswered words lingered, thick in the air, leaving both of them suspended in that fragile moment, with the truth still waiting just beyond. Reach. The shutter slammed once more in the wind, and the maid's words died in her throat. She stepped back, her fingers tight around the wood of the doorway, her face pale in the firelight. The old rancher did not look away. His question still hung between them, heavier than the storm pressing against the house walls. He had asked why she had said it, and he needed an answer, though he feared what that answer might do to him. The maid turned away, her back stiff, and hurried down the hall to her room. She closed the door with care, but her heart pounded loud, enough to drown out the quiet click of the latch. She leaned against the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes burning with tears she would not let fall. She had carried her secret too long, and now it was pressing harder against her chest, demanding release. Yet every time she tried to speak, fear wrapped its hands around her throat. The rancher sat by the fire long after the house grew silent. He had heard courage in her voice before the shutter broke her words. He knew she had something to say, something that could not be spoken easily. His hands, rough with years of work, rubbed together as if they could warm a part of him that no flame could reach. He was a man who had lived through storms, drought, and fire, but the quiet struggle in that young woman's eyes unsettled him more than anything he had known. The days that followed carried a strain that neither could name. Aloud, the maid moved through her chores with nervous care, while the rancher found himself watching her more than he should. The silence between them was no longer plain silence. It was charged, restless, always waiting to break. The land outside mirrored it, the prairie sky heavy with clouds, though no rain fell. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, their cries carrying farther across the fields than before. The rancher was not the only one who noticed. On his rare trips into town, he caught whispers following him. The townsfolk had always been curious about the maid. A young woman working alone in the house of a weathered rancher made for an easy subject of gossip. At the general store, voices lowered when he walked in. At the blacksmith's, men paused their hammering to trade looks. He kept his head down, buying supplies without a word, but he could feel their questions clinging to his back like dust. Maid, too, had her share of whispers. When she ventured into town for flour or cloth, the other women looked at her with knowing glances, though none dared speak openly. She carried herself with lowered eyes, but inside she burned with the weight of their judgment. She knew they thought she had come to the ranch for reasons other than work. She knew the words they used when her back was turned. It made her chest tighten, yet still she returned to the ranch, for leaving would mean giving them reason to believe their talk. One evening, as the sky bled red at the horizon, a figure appeared on the ranch road. A rider, hat low, horse lathered from a long ride. The rancher saw him first, standing at the fence line with his rifle resting easy in his arms. The maid watched from the porch, her hands clutching the railing. As the rider drew near, she felt her stomach drop. She knew that man, the rancher. greeted him with guarded eyes. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt. He was younger than the rancher, but older than the maid, his face sharp, his smile practiced. He tipped his hat toward the porch, and the maid turned away, quickly hiding her face. The rancher noticed, and something tightened in his chest. The rider spoke in a smooth tone, words that seemed meant to charm yet carried a weight beneath them. He said he was passing through, but his gaze lingered too long on the maid's retreating figure. He asked about the ranch, about the land, about how a man managed it all alone with only a girl for help. His questions pried like a knife, and though the rancher answered little, he felt the man's true purpose clear. That night, after the rider left, the maid did not appear at supper. The rancher found her later, sitting alone near the barn, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She would not meet his eyes. He asked her plain who the man was, but she only shook her head. Her silence told him more than words could. Whoever the rider was, he carried a piece of her past, and it was a past she feared returning. The days grew heavier after that. The rider's visit had stirred something in the maid, and the rancher felt the change in her. She worked with more urgency, as if keeping busy could chase away the weight pressing on her. Yet her eyes grew darker, her sleep shorter, her steps less steady. The rancher, though he tried to remain distant, felt the pull of her struggle. He wanted to ask again, wanted to demand the truth, but he feared breaking her fragile hold on herself. Meanwhile, the whispers in town grew louder. Some said the maid had run from trouble elsewhere. Others claimed she had debts, and a few whispered that she had been promised to a man who now hunted her. The rancher heard it all but spoke nothing. Still, each word deepened the conflict inside him. He had taken her in, given her a place, and in doing so, he had become part of whatever shadow followed her. One night, unable to rest, the rancher stepped outside. The stars were sharp above, the prairie stretched endless and dark. He walked to the barn, listening to the low sounds of the cattle. That was when he saw her again, sitting in the hay, knees pulled close, her face buried in her arms. She did not see him at first. When she lifted her head, her eyes glistened in the lantern light. She looked small, fragile, yet there was something unbroken in her gaze. He wanted to ask her then, wanted to tell her that she was not alone, but the words stuck. Instead, he set the lantern down and sat near, the distance between them filled with silence. She did not move away, though neither spoke. The sound of horses shifting in their stalls filled the quiet, and the night pressed close around them. Inside, the rancher battled with himself. He knew he was being pulled into something he could not yet see clearly. He knew the maid carried secrets, and secrets had a way of burning everything around them. Yet he could not bring himself to turn away. The maid, too, felt the storm rising inside her. Each day she carried her secret closer to the edge of her lips, but each day fear pulled it back again. She wanted to trust the rancher, wanted to lay bare the truth, but she saw the sorrow in his eyes and feared adding her burden to his. Still, the rider's shadow haunted her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he returned. The prairie. Wind carried a chill sharper than before, as if warning of what lay ahead. The rancher rose early, worked harder, yet the weight did not leave him. The maid moved softer, her eyes haunted, yet she did not leave. Together they carried their silence, both waiting, both dreading, for the moment when the truth would finally break through. And as the days shortened and the sky grew darker earlier with each evening, the rancher could not shake the feeling that the storm building between them would soon make every prairie storm before it seemed small. The prairie lay quiet under a sky the color of steel. The wind cut sharp across the open land, rattling the dry grass and carrying with it a sense of waiting, as if the earth itself knew something was coming. The old rancher felt it every time he stepped out at dawn, the weight in the air pressing against his chest. He had known storms before, had seen the way the land shifted before rain or fire, but this was different. This was not weather. This was something human, something dangerous, and it was drawing closer with each passing day. The maid felt it too. She moved quickly through her work, but her eyes lingered at the windows, her ears caught at every sound. She woke in the night, her breath tight, as if she had heard footsteps outside her door. Sometimes she thought she saw a shadow at the edge of the fields, a shape moving where none should be. When she blinked, it was gone, but the fear stayed with her. She told herself it was only her mind, only the storm in her heart, but she knew better. The rancher noticed her unease. He watched her from the barn, from the porch, saw the way her hand shook when she carried water, the way her eyes darted toward the road. He knew the rider would return. Men like that did not appear out of nowhere and vanish without cause. There was a purpose behind his visit, and the rancher feared what that purpose meant for them both. In town, the whispers grew louder. The rancher could feel the eyes on him when he walked into the store, could hear the low talk behind his back. They said the maid had run from something, that the rider had come for her, and that the ranch was no longer a safe place. Some warned him to send her away to protect his land and name. Others hinted that keeping her there would only bring ruin. The rancher did not answer them. He kept his silence, but inside his thoughts churned like the river in flood. The maid, too, heard the whispers. Women who once offered her smiles now turned cold. They did not speak it plain, but she could read it in their eyes. She was marked by suspicion, a stranger carrying secrets, and secrets were not welcome in small towns. Still, she returned to the ranch each time, her steps quick, her heart heavy. The ranch was the only place she had, and though fear pressed close, she could not walk away from it. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, the rancher stood by the corral, mending a broken rail. The wind had quieted, the sky burned orange, and for a moment the world seemed still. Then he saw it, a lone rider on the far ridge, watching. The shape was small against the horizon, but the rancher knew. The same sharp hat, the same steady posture. The rider had returned. He said nothing to the maid that night. She already carried too much fear, and he would not add to it until he was certain. But his eyes did not leave the horizon even long. After the rider was gone, he slept little, his hand close to the rifle by his bed, his ears sharp to every sound. The house creaked with the wind, and each creak felt like a warning. The maid sensed his unrest. She asked him the next morning if something troubled him, her voice soft, her face pale. He shook his head, unwilling to speak the truth, yet his silence only deepened her fear. She knew he was hiding something, and she knew what it must be. She had felt the rider's shadow long before the rancher had seen it. Days passed, each heavier than the last. The cattle grew restless, spooked by noises the rancher could not explain. At night, the dogs barked without cause, their growls low and uneasy. The maid clung to her work as if it could shield her, but the weight in her chest grew unbearable. She thought often of the words she had almost spoken that night by the fire. She knew the rancher deserved the truth, yet she could not bring herself to give it. Once spoken, it could never be taken back, and the world would shift in ways she could not control. One night, the storm broke. Not in rain, but in sound. The rancher woke to the horses screaming in the barn. He grabbed his rifle and ran into the dark, the maid following close behind, though he told her to stay. The barn doors shook against the wind, the animals inside wild with fear. He pulled the doors wide, lantern in hand, and the sight froze him. The back gate had been opened, the fence cut clean through. Someone had been there. The maid gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The rancher's jaw tightened as he scanned the dark fields beyond. The rider was no longer just a shadow on the ridge. He had come close enough to touch the heart of the ranch. The maid trembled at his side, her fear plain, and the rancher felt a surge of anger burn through his chest. Whoever the rider was, he was no stranger to her, and that truth was now spilling into his life. In the days that followed, the tension grew unbearable. The rancher kept his rifle close at all times, his eyes sharp to every movement on the land. The maid grew quieter, her face drawn, her steps heavy. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of hooves in the distance. She knew the rider would come again, and she knew he would not stop until he had what he wanted. The rancher began to press her, gently at first, then harder. He asked her who the man was, what he wanted, why he would not leave her be. She turned away each time, her lips pressed tight, her hands wringing in her lap. Finally, one night, her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "He will not stop." Her voice broke, and she fled the room before he could say more. Those words haunted him. He turned them over again and again as he worked, as he walked the land, as he sat by the fire in the silent nights. He thought of the fear in her eyes, the way her voice had cracked. He thought of the rider's practiced smile, the cut fence, the cattle stirred in the dark. He knew then that whatever bound the maid and the rider was more than rumor or gossip. It was something deep, something dangerous, and it was coming to his doorstep. The town, too, began to stir with unease. A stranger riding the edge of the land. Cattle spooked, fences cut. Men spoke of theft, of raids, of old grudges returned. The rancher heard their talk, but kept his silence. He knew this was no simple matter of stolen cattle. This was personal, and it centered on the maid who now moved like a shadow through his house. One evening, as the last light drained from the sky, the maid stood on the porch, her hands gripping the rail, her eyes fixed on the dark line of the horizon. She whispered something the rancher could not hear. When he stepped closer, she turned quickly, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, she looked as if she might speak, as if she might finally lay bare the secret she carried. But then the sound of distant hooves drifted across the fields, and the moment was gone. The rancher reached for his rifle, his body tense, his breath held. The maid clutched his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. The sound grew louder, closer, until the night seemed to tremble with it. The rancher felt his heart pound, each beat like a drum calling him to battle. The maid's face turned pale in the starlight, her eyes wide with dread. The rider had come at last, and the ranch stood on the edge of a storm greater than any wind or rain. The air thickened, the silence pressed close, and every shadow seemed alive with waiting. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle. The maid held her breath. The hooves drew nearer. The night was no longer quiet. It was a blade drawn, sharp and ready, poised above them both, and neither knew where it would fall. The hooves thundered closer until the sound swallowed the quiet of the prairie night. The rancher stood at the edge of the porch, rifle steady, his body braced as if the whole house leaned on his shoulders. The maid clung to his arm, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the darkness where the rider would appear. Then, out of the shadows, the horse broke through, carrying the figure that had haunted their thoughts for so long. The rider pulled up, sharp at the gate, the animal tossing its head with steam rising from its nostrils. The rancher did not move, but his voice came low and hard, asking what the man wanted. The rider swung down, his boots hitting the dirt with a sound that cut through the night air. He smiled again, that practiced smile, though his eyes burned with something colder. He said he had come for the maid, that she had left unfinished. Business, and he meant to see it through. The maid stepped forward, her hands trembling, her face pale yet determined. For the first time, she spoke the truth she had carried in silence. She told the rancher and the rider alike that she had once been bound to the man by promise, not of love but of force. She had fled before it could be sealed, running across the land until she found herself at the ranch. Her voice wavered but grew stronger as she spoke, saying she would not return, not to a life that would cage her. The writer laughed, though it rang sharp and bitter. He called her a runaway, said she owed him, said no rancher or storm could stand in his way. He took a step forward, but the rancher raised the rifle, the barrel catching the moonlight. His eyes were steady, his body rooted like the land itself. He said the maid was under his roof now, and no man would take her by force. The standoff stretched, silence heavy but for the restless stamp of the horse. The rider's hand twitched at his belt, but he froze under the rancher's aim. The maid stood between them, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her heart caught in the space where violence threatened to break. Then, in a voice that cut sharper than any weapon, she said she was done being silent. She said she would not be bought, not be traded, not be held by fear any longer. Her words carried into the night like thunder after lightning. The rider's face twisted, but the rancher did not flinch. He told the man to leave, told him the prairie was wide enough for those who had no place here. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the rider cursed under his breath, his smile broken, and swung back onto his horse. He glared at them both, but he did not draw. He pulled the reins hard, and the horse leapt forward, carrying him into the dark until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. The maid collapsed to her knees, her body shaking as though the fight had already been fought. The rancher lowered the rifle slowly, his breath heavy but steady. He bent to her side, lifting her gently to her feet. She leaned against him, the strength in her legs gone, but in her eyes there was something new relief, mixed with the fragile beginning of freedom. In the days that followed, the ranch grew quiet again, though the shadow of that night lingered. The cattle settled, the dogs calmed, and the land stretched wide under the endless sky. Yet inside the house, something had changed. The silence between the rancher and the maid was no longer heavy with fear or secrets. It was gentler now, filled with unspoken understanding. The town heard of what had happened. Word traveled fast on the prairie, carried from one porch to another. Some pitied the maid, others judged her still, but none dared question the rancher's stand. His quiet strength had drawn a line no one else would cross. And though the whispers did not die, they no longer carried the same bite. The maid began to move lighter in her days. She still worked hard, her hands busy from dawn to dusk, but her shoulders were not as bent, her steps not as hurried. At times she would pause at the window, watching the horizon, no longer with dread but with something closer to hope. She knew the writer might return someday, but she also knew she was no longer alone. The rancher, too, found his heart unsettled in new ways. He had lived so long without opening himself, so long believing the past had closed him off from anything more. Yet each evening, when he saw the maid's face lit by the fading sun, he felt something stir. It was not sudden or loud, but it was steady, like the land after rain, slowly filling with life again. They did not speak of love, not then. Words were not needed. Their bond was written in the long days of labor, in the quiet meals shared, in the nights when fear had held them and they had not let go, in the way he guarded her without asking, and the way she stayed by his side when leaving might have been easier. Winter came, and with it a hush over the prairie. Snow stretched across the fields, softening the world into silence. The rancher and the maid worked side by side, their breath rising in the cold, their steps carving paths through the white. Each evening they returned to the fire, the warmth not just in the flame but in the company they kept. The writer never came back. Perhaps he knew the fight was lost, or perhaps the land itself had swallowed him. Whatever the reason, his shadow no longer darkened the ranch. The maid carried scars of fear, but she carried also the strength of standing firm, of speaking her truth, of surviving. In time, the whispers in town faded. People had their own struggles, their own storms to weather, and the story of the maid and the rancher became another tale carried by the wind. Yet for those who had watched closely, it was a story of how silence can break, how courage can rise, and how even on the loneliest stretches of land, human hearts can find one another. The maid no longer felt like a shadow in someone else's house. The ranch had become hers as much as his, a place shaped not just by toil but by trust. The rancher, once a man closed off by loss, found himself looking forward instead of back. Together, they carved a life that was not perfect, but real, bound by storms weathered and truth spoken at last. And on quiet nights, when the wind slipped soft through the grass and the stars spread endless above, the maid would sit by the porch and remember the fear she once carried. She would think of the rider, of the past that had chased her, and she would feel no weight. She had chosen her path, and in that choice she had found freedom. The rancher would sit beside her, his silence steady, his presence enough. Words were few, but the bond between them did not need many. It was written in the land, in the long work of their hands, in the nights they had endured. A bond forged not in grand gestures, but in the simple, steady truth that neither had turned away when it mattered most. The prairie stretched wide around them, full of storms yet to come, full of days hard and days kind. But they were no longer two souls adrift. They were bound together, not by fear or by promise forced, but by choice, by trust, and by the quiet strength of shared life. In the end, that was the lesson left behind on the ranch, that even in silence, even in fear, even in the darkest nights when the storm pressed close, there could be light waiting. And when courage met that light, the world, wide and wild as it was, could become a place not just to survive but to belong. Top of form, bottom of form.